Hi, my name's Jo Gibson and I'm a clinical specialist physiotherapist working at the Liverpool Upper Limb Unit in Liverpool in the UK. Now, I've specialised in treating patients with shoulder pain or instability since 1995 when I got my specialist job. So I'm here today to share with you my 5 top tips for treating patients with shoulder pain. The evidence can be really confusing, but the great news is, having treated patients with shoulder pain for such a long period of time, I realise we probably have massively overcomplicated things, and there's some very simple things that can give us some good results. So my top tips, first of all, tip number 1, invest in the individual. When we look at the evidence base, it's absolutely clear that the majority of our prognostic factors lie within that psychosocial domain. Whether it be somebody's pain-related worrying or pain catastrophizing, fear avoidance, or actually their expectations, these things seem to have more effect on outcome than a lot of the physical things that we can measure. If we look at expectations, patients who have a positive expectation of physiotherapy, of a full recovery, are far more likely to do well with our interventions. So we can see the importance of investing what a patient believes about their pain, what they understand about it, what their concerns are, and importantly, what their expectations are. The good news is the evidence would suggest we can reshape those expectations when they're perhaps not what we would want them to be. The other thing that's interesting when we look at understanding that individual is the relevance of comorbidities, lack of exercise, lifestyle factors. All these things seem to have a massive influence on our ability to get patients better. So by understanding these things, we can see where we target our treatment right from the beginning. It's interesting that self-efficacy is something that seems to modulate some of those negative psychosocial factors. So if we can establish a patient's self-efficacy, that is their confidence to do their activity despite their shoulder pain, then again it helps guide where to start. So if a patient comes to you with very severe pain and doesn't have a history of a pathology that's likely to present with that type or level of pain, then immediately, with a lack of self-efficacy accompanying that, we see we really need to target addressing those beliefs and expectations. Our therapeutic alliance is absolutely key, so investing in the individual is definitely number 1. My second top tip is unload to reload. So patients come to us with pain, they can't do the things that they want to do, and so how can we make it easier for the shoulder to do its job, to let everything calm down so that we can then load it back up again and get them fit for function? Well, how do we unload the shoulder? Very simply, we can support it using a table, using their other arm, using the wall, just unloading that limb sufficiently for them to be able to move with more confidence. The other way we can achieve this is literally by just changing the lever arm. So if I have a patient who's got pain through elevation, I can just change that lever arm and make it easier for them to get that muscle system doing its job. The bottom line is people who have pain move in a different way. They change their movement behaviour. And a common theme in the literature is they tend to use the big muscles around their shoulder in an effort to move, in an effort to protect. So just by changing that strategy, making it easier for the muscles to do their job, can have a real effect on unloading that system and actually influencing somebody's pain. And Cools has done some lovely research looking at just doing a simple through range short lever exercise with some external rotation resistance, and that seems to give us really good value in getting the cuff and the scapular muscles doing their job, but also calming down some of these protective patterns. Why does that matter? We don't want to look at the cuff or the scapula in isolation. Those things work as a functional unit, and simple exercises like this through range external rotation with that unload to reload principle really seem to be a good place to start. So that's tip number 2. Tip number 3, this is really about integrating the chain for the gain. So integrating the kinetic chain to make rehabilitation easier for our patients. I was very lucky to do a fellowship in Kentucky with Ben Kibler and Tim Ewell, and if you've read the evidence, they really are the kinetic chain leaders. Now for me, why incorporate the kinetic chain? Well, it follows on from that unload to reload principle, is that if we initiate our shoulder exercises with a step up, some form of weight transfer, then it seems to have a positive effect on facilitating recruitment of the local scapular muscles, but also potentially making life easier for the shoulder. So it reduces the perceived effort for your patients. There's probably an element of distraction, but fundamentally it makes it easier for your patient to get moving their arm and change that pain experience. There's all sorts of fabulous potential neurological mechanisms as well. And again, just facilitating the fact that we rarely use our arm in isolation. So integrating the chain for the gain is my number 3 tip. In terms of tip number 4, this is about how wonderful we are as human beings in terms of we have this fabulous sensory system that we can use to facilitate or change how somebody moves, but also their experience of pain. And our education and our reassurance of patients absolutely underpins that. But when you consider that just using a tactile cue, a visual cue, giving somebody a target to work towards as opposed to just doing an exercise, particularly if it has meaning for them, or any way of enhancing sensory input. The shoulder is a real sensory animal. It really likes attention. So if we give it some tactile feedback, or we use a piece of TheraBand to give some resistance, or we do a weight-bearing exercise, closed chain exercises have a great history in shoulder rehabilitation, and that probably is because, one, they promote stability in the joint, but importantly are very proprioceptive and give good value in terms of getting the cuff and scapular muscles doing their job. So again, if we look at priming proprioception, there are lots of ways that we can target that sensory system and make rehabilitation easier for our patients. So remember, simple things, a little bit of resistance or load actually can make the exercise more proprioceptive. Using the kinetic chain, again, potentially enhances the proprioceptive or sensory motor aspects of our exercise. Simple change in hand position can also have a similar effect. So if we make a fist, it's been shown to have a good effect on getting that feed forward activation of the rotator cuff before we do a movement. Similarly, as I say, tactile visual cues again have been shown to change somebody's movement efficiency. So we have this fabulous sensory toolbox to go at to help change that patient's pain experience. So that's priming proprioception, tip number 4. Now, tip number 5 is really going back to talking about the rotator cuff. Now, I said that essentially we want to work the cuff and scapula together. And I think if we're honest, if we look at many of the exercises out there, whether somebody claims to have a scapular bias or a cuff bias, the hard reality is these exercises never differentiate one from the other. They're always working the whole system. So what do I mean by target the tendon or target torque? And actually my 5th tip is target torque and the tendon. Really what I'm talking about here is there is good evidence that in patients with shoulder pain, one of the prime deficits is a loss of external rotation strength. Now, in terms of trying to rehabilitate that, what's really key to understand is if we just do some of our normal external rotation exercises, particularly in somebody who's got shoulder pain, then actually that doesn't give us best value of targeting that system. There's a whole lot of other muscles working, particularly the higher we come into range, our deltoid and our latissimus dorsi then act as stabilizers. So essentially we're just rehabbing the whole system, and if a patient has pain, that's going to give us less value for our rotator cuff. So a real great way to target that rotator cuff, ensuring we have that external rotation bias, but while still activating the scapula in its stability role, is just doing supported cuff work until the patient can actually build up to a load where they can cope with about 5% of body weight. Then we can move on to our unsupported cuff-related exercises or general shoulder strengthening. The last little part of this targeting torque and the tendon is also to understand the value of eccentric exercise. If we look at the evidence in patients who have had what sounds like good rehabilitation, but actually have had maybe 12 weeks and aren't progressing the way that we'd hope, then there does seem to be some real potential in terms of eccentric exercise. What does eccentric exercise do? Well, it seems to have a more specific effect on the intrinsic tendon, but also has more of an effect on recruitment patterns, but also on that proprioceptive value. So again, eccentric in patients that haven't responded to some of our normal exercise do seem to get some additional benefit by incorporating eccentric. But interestingly, that's eccentric rotation exercises as opposed to eccentric abduction, which seems to be much more provocative. So my last 5th tip is all about thinking about that external rotation weakness, supporting the arm and building up to that 5% of body weight before we do unsupported exercise. And then also in patients perhaps who have failed good intervention, thinking that eccentric exercise may have some additional benefit. So guys, those are my 5 tips. The first, invest in the individual, acknowledging that many of our prognostic factors are within that psychosocial domain and those lifestyle factors. If we understand that from the outset and establish our patients' beliefs, expectations and concerns, we set the foundation for success and we build that therapeutic alliance by helping our patient understand we're really listening to what matters to them, but importantly reframing it in a way that sets them on that rehabilitation journey. And tip number 2 is very much thinking about that unload to reload. Make life easier for the system so we can change those movement behaviours, change that pain experience and get the patient back on the road to success. Our 3rd top tip was that integrate the chain for the gain. So remember, just by initiating our shoulder exercises with a step up or a weight transfer, we immediately make life easier for the shoulder and facilitate that local recruitment, potentially unloading that system and making our exercise more sensory motor rich. So we've got our invest in the individual, unload to reload, integrating the chain for the gain, and then our 4th top tip was priming proprioception, utilising that amazing sensory system that we have in an effort to make our exercise more proprioceptive, make more sense to the brain, but also help change some of those movement behaviours and as ever improve that pain experience for our patients. We have these amazing human bodies with lots of different ways of targeting that sensory system and influencing that muscle system. And our 5th and final tip was about targeting torque and that intrinsic tendon. Remember, external rotation weakness seems to be a key feature of most studies looking at strength in patients with shoulder pain. By supporting the arm, we better target the cuff and scapula, we build that up to 5% of body weight, we can then be confident to do strengthening for the upper quadrant that's functionally specific to the patient. And in those patients that perhaps you're reviewing for colleagues or have seen physios before and not done as well as we think or we think they should do, then there would seem to be some potential benefit of eccentric exercise. Remember, rotation eccentric exercise seems to be less provocative and have a sounder evidence base in terms of impacting that intrinsic tendon. So guys, those are my 5 top tips. Invest in the individual, unload to reload, integrate the chain for the gain, priming proprioception, and then finally targeting torque and that intrinsic tendon. I really hope you've enjoyed that, and I think that sums up some of the key things that I consider every time I have a patient with shoulder pain in front of me. If you want to learn more and you want to know about a simple structured approach to assessment that immediately tells you where to start with your patients, then don't hesitate to have a look at the e-learning package that I've put together with the Agents EBP in an effort to make you confident and enjoy treating your shoulder patients. It reflects the current evidence base. There's lots of modules, lots of practical tips and tricks and exercises that you can immediately employ in your practice. But for now, I really hope you've enjoyed my top tips. Thanks for listening and enjoy treating your patients with shoulder pain.